Welcome to our channel, your very own daily dose of stories. Today's story is, You Can't Replace Me. Part 1, The Calm Before the Storm. You're fired.
It was a regular Tuesday morning when I was called into the office. The usual corporate hum, the faint sound of keyboard clicks, the coffee machine whirring in the background. But that morning, something felt off. Matt, my boss, who'd been managing his own little empire of incompetence, pulled me aside and in his usual efficiency expert tone, told me they were letting me go. Before lunch. I didn't flinch, though. In fact, I almost smirked. The timing was too perfect, too poetic. You see, the corporate world is a game of strategy, of power plays and hidden agendas, and here I was, about to be tossed aside like an old playbook. But Matt had no idea that the very decision he was making was setting off a chain reaction that would collapse his entire $300 million deal before the afternoon was even over. It's funny how things work out like that. One minute, you're just another employee, the next, you're the reason the whole house of cards falls apart. Matt had always been the type to look at a room and think he had all the answers, like a person who's memorized a few buzzwords and now believes they invented innovation. He was 35 but looked like a corporate robot, expensive suit, shiny shoes, the kind of guy who spoke like every meeting was a TED Talk. When he called me into his office that morning, I already knew what was coming. The same tired phrases I'd heard a dozen times in corporate offices around the world: we're streamlining, we need to stay ahead of the curve, and of course, this is nothing personal, it's just business. His eyes had that glint of someone who's just learned a new phrase. Disruptive innovation, I bet, and he thought it was going to change everything. Dana, he started, looking up from his laptop with a forced smile. You've been a valuable member of the team, no doubt. But we're rethinking some roles around here, and unfortunately, we have to make some tough decisions. We're moving toward a more agile structure, and your role, well, it's a bit redundant. Redundant. He said it like I was a piece of software that needed updating or deleting, without considering the years I'd poured into building systems, processes, and relationships that kept the company afloat. He didn't seem to notice that every regulatory system, every compliance framework, and every legal step we took was tied to my name. No, Matt's idea of efficiency was cutting off the hands that made the clockwork run smoothly because it looked sleeker on paper. It was all about looking good for the next investor meeting, not about substance. I sat there, nodding, barely containing a laugh. Matt, the efficiency fixer, had no idea that the very systems he was so eager to streamline were the only thing keeping the company compliant with the federal regulations that he likely only heard about in passing at some overpriced conference in the Bahamas. I didn't argue. There was no point. He had already made up his mind, as corporate types do. His self-importance was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. He probably felt like he was doing me a favor. You've had a good run, he said, as though it were some sort of graduation speech. But we're evolving, and we need fresh ideas to match our new direction. Fresh ideas. That's what they always say, right? As if new ideas magically fix everything. Especially when the fresh ideas come from a guy who couldn't tell you the difference between a regulatory certification and a vending machine snack. The truth is, he didn't care about ideas, he cared about one thing, making sure he looked good in front of the board. He wasn't interested in the details. The very details that, if ignored, could bring down everything he was building. I could have called him out. I could have explained just how naive he was to think that firing someone with my knowledge wouldn't have consequences. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, the kind of smile you give when you're about to win a battle you've already won. You know the kind, calm, collected, like a chess player watching their opponent walk right into a trap. Matt went on, rambling about his vision for the future, about how we were going to streamline our processes, eliminate redundancies, and modernize the company. As he spoke, his words started to blend together, just noise in the background. I wasn't listening anymore. Instead, I was mentally cataloging every compliance document, every licensing certificate, every crucial piece of information that tied the company's legal fate to my name. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Matt thought he had won. He thought he was cutting the fat, moving us into a new era of innovation. He couldn't have been more wrong. Because while he fired me, he also fired the one person who understood how to keep the lights on and, more importantly, how to keep the regulators off our backs. In his quest to modernize, he had just laid the groundwork for his own downfall. But Matt didn't see it. He was too busy planning his next big presentation, oblivious to the fact that everything he was about to build was about to come crashing down around him. I stood up, shook his hand with that same cold smile, and walked out of the room. I wasn't angry. I wasn't upset. In fact, I almost felt sorry for him.
Part 2. Brace yourself. Upcoming storm.
The door clicked shut behind me, and I could feel Matt's smug little smile still lingering in the air. As I walked back to my desk, it was almost like I was floating, everything felt oddly calm. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe it was just the quiet certainty that I had just been given the perfect opportunity. But I wasn't about to make a scene. I wasn't going to storm out or yell. That's not my style. Instead, I sat down at my desk and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle into my bones. There was no time to waste on emotion. There was a plan to execute. I opened my laptop, the familiar hum of it bringing me back to reality. First things first, I needed to make sure all of my work was backed up. Not just the stuff on my desktop, but the hundreds of documents, spreadsheets, and databases I had built over the years. Each one of them was a piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that Matt had just taken a hammer to without realizing it. My first step was simple: back up everything. I didn't need to make a dramatic scene. I didn't need to burn any bridges just yet. I quietly opened the folder that contained all the critical licensing documents. There were federal renewal timestamps, internal compliance chains tied to my name, contracts, and every other piece of paper that kept the company from slipping into chaos. I'd worked long hours to make sure those systems ran smoothly, and today I was going to take extra care to ensure that no one else had access to them. I clicked Save As, renaming the folder Church Pancake Recipes, just in case anyone was going to snoop later. You know, keep things innocent. I wasn't about to leave behind any evidence of my intentions. I backed everything up to a private drive. Not because I thought anyone was going to search my computer, but because in corporate environments, everything is temporary. Just like Matt. The people who think they're invincible always leave behind little cracks that you can slip through. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. While the files were uploading, I took a moment to reflect. I hadn't expected to be fired, but I also wasn't surprised. Matt had made it clear from day one that he saw anyone with too much knowledge as a potential threat. When you're the only one who truly understands how a system works, people like Matt start to feel uneasy. They don't like being reminded that their position isn't as secure as they think. They like to surround themselves with people who can be replaced, not people who can run the whole operation. And that's exactly what I was: irreplaceable. At least, for now. I opened the contract on my desk, the one nobody ever reads. Section 7C. Involuntary termination. It wasn't the first time I'd read it. I'd gone over it several times in my career, just in case things went sideways. That clause was my safety net. If I were ever let go, the companies paid for licenses and certifications were to be revoked within 48 hours. No one would ever be able to use them again without my signature, without me. The power was in my hands. I knew Matt didn't understand what he had just done. He had fired the one person who held the keys to the entire system. As I read over Section 7C again, a part of me felt a small sense of satisfaction. No, this wasn't revenge. This was just business. The company needed to understand the value I had brought, and the only way for that lesson to sink in was for them to feel the consequences of their actions. The clock was ticking. I needed to act fast. As I double-checked the backup files, I pulled up the internal compliance dashboard and quickly revoked my access from the system. I had built that dashboard from scratch, after all. I knew it better than anyone else. If Matt thought he could just give away control to someone else, he was about to learn a hard lesson. I wasn't going to let some intern fumble through the process and cause a regulatory disaster just because Matt didn't know what he was doing. I made sure every credential tied to me was secured, every license reissued in my name. It was all under control. I even took the time to print out my contract clause and neatly filed it away. Just in case things got messy later. The company may have fired me, but they couldn't erase what I'd done. Then, I took a moment to sit back and breathe. I looked out the window at the gray sky, the usual office buzz humming around me. Everyone else was completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. But not me. I had already won. My role, my knowledge, my skills, none of that could be replaced by Matt's shiny new vision. I had the map, and they had just torn it in half. The question was, how would they cope when they realized they were lost? I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I knew what was coming, and I was ready for it. And as I sat there, calmly finishing my coffee, I couldn't help but smile. The game was on, and Matt had just walked right into my trap. By the time Matt had finished his smug little spiel about streamlining and restructuring, I could feel the weight of what was coming, even if he couldn't. I left the office quietly, without drama, but I wasn't done. Far from it. While Matt had fired me in the morning, he had no idea that his little efficiency move would set off a chain of events that would bring everything down by the afternoon. The collapse didn't happen immediately. It started slowly, like the faint rumble of thunder in the distance, barely noticeable at first but growing louder by the minute. I stayed a little later than usual that day, not because I had to, but because I wanted to watch the system breathe. If Matt thought he was just pushing a button to get rid of me, he was gravely mistaken. No, what he'd just done was like pulling a thread on a sweater. The whole damn thing was about to unravel. The first sign came around lunchtime. I was sitting at home, nursing a cold coffee, scrolling through my phone when I saw a message pop up from a colleague who still hadn't quite figured out that I wasn't there anymore. "Hey, are you seeing this?" he asked, followed by a link to the company's internal dashboard. I clicked on the link with a certain sense of dread. When I saw what was happening, my gut clenched. A red flag lit up on the compliance dashboard. Then another. And another. There were at least 20 notifications, each one signaling a different disaster. Systems that had been running smoothly for years were suddenly malfunctioning. Licenses were marked as invalid. Certificates were expiring. Some were about to be nullified in under an hour. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a mistake. It was a bomb going off, and Matt didn't even know he'd lit the fuse. I didn't respond to my colleague's message. There was no need. The chain reaction had already started, and nothing could stop it now. The real chaos began in the early afternoon when Matt walked into the office with that same smug, self-assured smile. He'd been on a conference call, no doubt talking about the big $300 million deal he was about to close, his golden ticket to the corner office. His whole career hinged on it. But what he didn't know was that the deal was already slipping through his fingers like sand. The very licenses he thought were secure, the ones he believed he could delegate to an intern, were about to implode. Within an hour of his arrival, the first phone call came in. The vendor we'd been working with for months, the one supplying critical components for one of our biotech clients, called our procurement team to say they couldn't fulfill their shipment. The reason? Simple, the certification tied to the project had been revoked. No license, no shipment. The vendor couldn't even legally deliver the goods. The whole project was now in jeopardy, and Matt had no idea. Then came the second call. It was from our regulatory partner, a key player in Matt's big $300 million deal. They couldn't proceed with the compliance review because the signature authority tied to the project was no longer valid. They needed a certified officer to reauthorize everything, but the system had been locked out. By now, I knew exactly what was happening. I was the one who controlled those licenses, the one who had the keys to the vault. And Matt? Well, he was fumbling around in the dark, trying to put out fires he couldn't even see. I could picture it clearly in my mind, Matt pacing his office, panicked, calling IT, asking if they could override the system. I imagined him shouting at his team, trying to fix the mess he had no understanding of, all while the clock ticked down to his impending collapse. But there was no quick fix. Not for this kind of problem. Not when you've neglected the foundation of the operation for so long. The more he tried to solve the issue, the deeper the hole got. By mid-afternoon, the entire company was on high alert. Matt was sending frantic emails, trying to figure out what was happening with the compliance system. He had no idea that I was the only one who could make it right. By then, I had already made sure the system was impenetrable. He couldn't get in. No one could. And it was all unraveling, slowly, surely, like a house of cards in a windstorm. As I sat back, watching the chaos unfold, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. Was this really happening? Was Matt really going to watch his $300 million deal collapse because of his own arrogance and incompetence? The thought was almost too perfect to be true. But the best part came a few hours later, when the final blow hit. The audit, the one Matt had been so desperate to pass to secure the deal, was scheduled for the next day. But it couldn't happen. Not without me. Matt's shiny new streamlined process had stripped the company of its only licensed compliance officer. Without the necessary authorizations, the audit would be dead in the water. And the deal? Well, the deal was as good as gone. I wasn't the only one who knew it, either. By the time the vendors had started pulling back, and the regulators were making their calls, the higher-ups at the company were beginning to sweat. Rumors were circulating that the deal was at risk, and no one knew what to do. Meanwhile, Matt, ever the visionary, was still desperately trying to put a positive spin on things. But you can't spin a train wreck. Not when it's happening right in front of you. When I got the final call from an old colleague, telling me that the $300 million deal had officially collapsed, I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't just that Matt had failed. It wasn't just that his arrogance had led to the destruction of a deal he'd worked so hard to secure. It was that he still had no idea why it had all fallen apart. He would never understand what had happened, not really. He would just chalk it up to bad luck, maybe. But the truth was, he had fired the one person who held the power to make everything run smoothly. And now, it was too late. The system had broken down, the deal had collapsed, and Matt? He was left to pick up the pieces. But there were no pieces to pick up. The foundation had crumbled, and he had no idea how to rebuild it.
Part 3, House of Cards, The Done Deal.
The chaos didn't end when Matt's $300 million deal collapsed. If anything, that was just the beginning of the real mess. The office, once buzzing with the false energy of a corporate machine that believed it could do no wrong, was now a sea of confusion. The emails started flooding in, and the phone calls, well, they never stopped. Everyone in the company who had been so quick to praise Matt's forward-thinking leadership was now frantically trying to fix a disaster that was too big to fix. And all the while, Matt, who had been so sure of his brilliant decisions just hours ago, was now the very picture of corporate panic. Matt's usual swagger had disappeared. He was pacing his office like a man who had just realized he'd stepped onto a train track and the train was coming. The phone never stopped ringing, but he didn't know who to call. IT couldn't fix the system, he'd cut the very cord that kept everything running. HR had no answers for him either. Compliance? That was long gone. The contractors, who had been waiting for confirmation, were starting to pull out. One by one, the pieces of his meticulously crafted empire began to crumble. Meanwhile, the rest of the office was caught in a storm of its own. I watched from the sidelines, amused at the absurdity of it all. The same people who had blindly followed Matt, who had patted him on the back and called him a genius for his vision, were now panicking. The interns, who had once nodded like loyal soldiers during Matt's endless presentations about streamlining, were now whispering in corners, unsure of what to do. The senior managers, the ones who had once deferred to him like he held the secret to the universe, were suddenly scrambling for solutions to problems they didn't understand. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Matt tried to hold it together, but his words came out more as stammering than leadership. We're just figuring this out, guys, he said, standing in front of a group of managers who were all nervously glancing at their phones, watching their clients pull out. We'll get this back on track. We have a plan. We can make this work. But nobody was listening. Matt was no longer the fixer. He was the problem. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I could almost feel the shift, the realization that Matt had no idea what he was doing. The realization that everything he had worked so hard to build was built on a house of cards. And the worst part? He didn't even realize that the reason everything was falling apart was the very decision he'd made that morning, firing me. I had been the one holding the pieces together, the one who knew where the legal landmines were, the one who had ensured that everything ran without a hitch. Without me, the system was like a car without an engine, it was useless. And the higher-ups? They knew it. I watched them exchange nervous glances as the crisis deepened, knowing they would have to find a way to fix. From my home, I watched the office descend into chaos with a sense of detached satisfaction. The frantic emails from HR and the begging voicemails from Matt's assistant were all ignored. They were reaping what they had sown. The multi-million-dollar deal Matt had been so proud of was crumbling, clients were fleeing, and vendors were pulling out. The very forward momentum he'd used to justify my firing, the cutting of corners and people, was now destroying his empire. The irony was perfect. Matt, who had dismissed me with arrogant ease, was now frantically calling IT and HR, completely out of his depth. He was learning a brutal lesson: you cannot replace institutional knowledge with buzzwords. The only person who could have saved him was the one he'd just thrown away. When my phone finally flashed with his personal number, I let it go to voicemail. His message was exactly what I expected, stripped of all its former confidence, laced with pure panic. Dana, his voice crackled, strained and desperate. We need to talk. I've made a huge mistake. I know I've been wrong, but we need you back. Please. You're the only one who can fix this. I'll do anything. I savored the moment before calling him back. The power had irrevocably shifted. Matt, I said, my voice calm and cool. I'm not going to come back. What? No, Dana, please, this is serious. We're losing everything, he pleaded, his voice breaking. You should have thought about that before you fired me, I interrupted, my tone sharp. You didn't just fire an employee. You fired the one person who knew how to keep this entire system running. You're now seeing what happens when you break something without knowing how to fix it. A long, heavy silence followed. I could hear his defeat through the phone. I didn't know, he admitted, his voice small. I didn't realize. I'm sorry, Matt, I said, though I felt no sorrow. But I'm not your savior. You made your bed. I hung up, leaving him in the ruin of his own making. The man who had everything, title, resources, power, had nothing I needed. And I had everything he had just lost. In the weeks that followed, the collapse became permanent. The deal vanished, and the company was left conducting desperate damage control. Matt was demoted, his reputation in tatters, now just another middle manager buried in the bureaucracy he'd created. I, meanwhile, moved on. I accepted a role as head of compliance strategy at a new company, a position where my expertise was not only valued but essential, and with a salary to match. I didn't need to gloat, my success was the final word. The lesson was clear. For Matt, it was a painful education in humility and the real meaning of leadership. For me, it was a confirmation that the ultimate power often lies not in fighting the system, but in knowing your own worth and having the confidence to walk away, allowing arrogance to fail on its own terms.
We hope you enjoyed the story. Visit this page for more stories.